G'day everyone and welcome to the POLSIS podcast. On this week's podcast, we'll be looking at the South China Sea after last week's ruling in the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. With me today is Associate Professor Andrew Phillips from POLSIS.
Hello, Brian.
And Associate Professor Shahar Hameiri from the Graduate Centre in Governance and International Affairs.
Hi, Brian.
Thank you both for being here. So, the South China Sea, why is this region so important to the world?
Brian, one of the major reasons that it's important is because of its significance as a major maritime trade arterial for the region. One of the key characteristics of the Asia-Pacific as a strategic environment is the huge degree of economic interdependence. Now, the vast majority of the trade occurring at the moment is still waterborne trade. The South China Sea is absolutely critical to that. It is why states in the region have been so insistent on exercising freedom of navigation rights through the region. So it's important at that level. But secondly, and from the Chinese perspective, what is most distinctive about it is that the Chinese very much consider this their immediate maritime periphery. The countries that can dominate the region in terms of mastering control over the South China Sea have huge strategic leverage potentially over China. So it's crucial in terms of trade. It is also crucial in terms of the security of China's immediate maritime backyard.
I think it's also probably important to add that there are a couple of countries in the Pacific that have a security alliance with the United States. The United States is very much present in that part of the world. So for some people, at least, within China and within the United States, what happens in the South China Sea is seen as some kind of an indicator of where things could potentially be heading in other parts of the world as well.
So it's sort of like a game of chess between China and America in that sort of region.
I wouldn't put it quite that way because I think that a game of chess generates an sort of image of two players fully aware of all the pieces, where they're going, where they are on the table. I don't think that's quite what it looks like in the South China Sea. I think there are a number of actors, for example, like the provincial government of Hainan province in China and fishing militias and a whole range of different players like that are active in that part of the world and that do a lot of things in an uncoordinated way that sometimes puts, for example, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China on the spot where they have to post hoc explain what actually happened, find rationalization, try to excuse it, or sometimes try to work within China to bring everyone under the same roof. And it's not that easy.
So we've been talking a lot about China, so I think this is a sort of a good point to sort of look at this notion that many nations claim regions and a lot of regions in South China Sea, and I'll throw a map up so you can see what we're talking about. But I thought probably a good idea at the moment to sort of focus in on China because that's where the discussion is heading. What is the basis of the Chinese claim for that entire maritime region?
Well, the Chinese argument is one that is based initially on the historic claim of the nationalist government that was asserted in the late 1940s and famously talked about the idea of a Ninedash line claim, which essentially claims the vast majority of the South China Sea, essentially as a Chinese lake. Now, the Chinese Communist government, which came to power in October 1949, repudiated most of the nationalist legacy, except tellingly for the South China Sea historical claims. So their argument is based primarily on historical claims, and it is also based more recently on a recognition of the increasing potential economic value and importance of this region. Most importantly, though, it is worthwhile keeping in mind that when this was finally brought to a head legally, when this was brought before the Permanent Court of Arbitration, the court explicitly ruled on this question and determined that China's decision to ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea explicitly superseded their earlier claim to the Ninedash line in terms of the historic case for that. So that is what's one of the major legal findings that's come out of the most recent adjudication.
I would add to that, Brian, that although China and Chinese leaders of various levels of government have mentioned the Ninedash line repeatedly, China has never actually formally, in any way, pursued the Ninedash line through any international legal means. So it remains something that has been stated as belonging to China, as Andrew was just saying, but there's never been any action to actually make it happen beyond the actions that have been taking place over the last few years, which are more informal in nature.
So what are some of those actions? There's a lot of talk about building islands in the middle of the sea. Is this something that's just been blown out of the water, or are we literally making islands in the South China Sea?
Well, there's no doubt that the Chinese or various actors within China have been undertaking pretty extensive dredging activities to build up islands in the South China Sea, actually creating thousands of acres in the middle of the ocean that were not there before, and in the process causing considerable damage to the coral reef and to the marine wildlife environment as well. I think it's important to mention they're not the only ones doing it. Vietnam has been building islands as well, for example. And in fact, China is a bit of a latecomer to the island building game, but they've done it on a far greater scale than anyone else. And the idea about about building those islands is that the islands could then be used as a means of pursuing more normal claims under the United Nations Conventions of Law of the Sea, which provide an exclusive economic zone around islands. This is another ruling of the Permanent Court in The Hague, that the islands that are being constructed by China or anyone else in the South China Sea cannot be considered islands under the UNCLOS, under the convention.
Yeah, and this is a good point. So just to let everyone know, last week the Permanent Court of Arbitration in the ruling of Philippines versus China ruled against China, as we've said here. So can we just throw up the law and order clang and call it a day, or is this ruling not actually going to lead to anything?
Well, the great difficulty, obviously, with international law, particularly when you're dealing with a rising power, is always the question of enforcement. And this is going to be the issue that has already been very much crystallised in this case. The Chinese have been quite explicit in denouncing the ruling and suggesting that their claims remain valid. And in fact, they have most recently escalated their military exercises in the South China Sea as a means of practically demonstrating their reluctance to concede the legitimacy of this ruling. So really, this is not the end of the South China Sea story at all. In fact, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, it's really potentially the end of the beginning. Now that we have the legal clarification on this, this is when things get interesting. This is when, with the legal precedent established, the various actors within the region are going to think very carefully about how to proceed in advancing their respective claims.
My sense in respect to the arbitration decision from last week is that the senior leadership in Beijing is not actually keen to pursue significant escalation of the situation in the South China Sea. There are a number of indicators for that. For instance, they've been clamping down on expressions of ultranationalism on social media and have not allowed massive protests in front of the Filipino embassy in Beijing, unlike, for example, in the East China Sea in the past with Japan, where fairly significant protests took place. That suggests that they're not interested in creating a hostile environment within China that could perhaps lay the ground for more aggressive action in the South China Sea. That doesn't mean to say that they'll just accept the court decision and just go back as if nothing happened. But I think that the circumstances at the moment within the Philippines suggest that there are leaders there at the moment that are quite prepared to talk to each other. Whatever you think about Rodrigo Duterte, who's the recently elected president of the Philippines, when it comes to the South China Sea, he seems to be far more pragmatic than his predecessor Aquino. And I suspect that that's going to be where most activity is going to take place over the coming years. So the presidents and senior leaders within both countries are going to try and find some kind of a compromise.
So since we've mentioned the Philippines, I think it'd be a good idea now to sort of look at some of the more regional security implications. We've already sort of touched on the USA and things like that. So is the South China Sea a potential flashpoint going forward for potential conflict, or is this just making a mountain out of a molehill?
I'd suggest that it's definitely a flashpoint, but it is worth keeping a bit of perspective. It is one flashpoint among many. One of the master trends in world politics, at least since the Taiwan Straits crisis of 1996, has been a growing strategic estrangement between the United States and China, even as there's been increasing economic interdependency between the two. Now, what is interesting about the dynamics of the South China Sea at the moment, this actually relates to an observation that Shahar made earlier, the dynamics of the South China Sea conflicts, and I use the word conflicts in the plural quite deliberately, these conflicts are far more complex and involve a far broader array of actors than is typically recognised by international relations commentators. That having been said, the South China Sea dispute is important as much because of the perception of it as being a key flashpoint between the United States and China as anything else. So when analysts are looking at the region at the moment, there is a reductive tendency to see this entirely through the lens of the US-Chinese rivalry. The great problem with that reductive tendency is that it has a danger of actually being acquiring a self-perpetuating element to it. So yes, it's important, but it is one of many flashpoints, and the complexities of the conflict shouldn't be reduced to one rivalry alone.
As far as I'm concerned, I think the greatest threat for military conflict in that part of the world, which is very real in my view, that risk is very real, would come largely out of miscalculation or a response to an action by one of the actors that are acting in that region, perhaps a little bit at arm's length from governments, especially the Chinese government in this case. We've seen, for example, the Hainan provincial government, which is officially the administrative body that governs the entire South China Sea on behalf of China. You know, that they've got that administrative remit. So we've seen a Hainan Airlines airplane land on the one of the strips that were built on the islands in the South China Sea. That's a clear indication that, at least as far as they're concerned, they would like to maintain some degree of control over that part of the world. And that is largely to do with fishing. One of the things that is often overlooked when it comes to the South China Sea is that pretty much all of the confrontations on the high seas there were between fishing trawlers and coast guards, not naval ships, pretty much in all cases. So that's an important factor. And the question then becomes, you know, whether these actors can take things further. Will the national governments be able to rein them in a bit more? Whether some actions will be perceived as emanating from the national governments, whether there is some kind of an agenda that involves the national government and these more localized actors, it's very hard to say. But I think that's the greatest risk. You know, I think the risk of miscalculation and overreaction, I think, is very real.
So one of the key sort of triggers of, if not conflict, at least annoyance in the region is every now and then the United States sends a Navy patrol, puts together a giant big aircraft carrier and floats it through the South China Sea. Are things like that helping in any way, or are they just there for provocation's sake?
Well, I think it's important to note that the United States, since 1945, has been the hegemonic guarantor of peace and security within the region. A key part of that role has been assuring the freedom of navigation that has been essential to underpinning the region's economic integration. So if you look at the way that the region has evolved, we've seen an enormous growth in prosperity in first Japan, later South Korea, Southeast Asia, and in China, and that has been built on the basis of these countries pursuing an export-oriented model of industrialisation that is in turn underpinned by freedom of the sea. So the United States cannot easily walk away from that commitment. It cannot easily say, well, the Seventh Fleet's remit, its responsibility to maintain freedom of the sea, is something that is somehow now subject to negotiation. The flip side of that, though, nevertheless, is that what weakens the United States' position quite seriously from a perspective of public diplomacy in the situation of the South China Sea is that it is very difficult to lecture the Chinese and tell the Chinese that they must adhere to the requirements of international law when the United States itself has not ratified the UN Convention on the Laws of the Sea. There is essentially a key reputational gap at the moment between the United States claiming hegemonic status, invoking the requirements of international law, but at the same time not being subject, choosing not to be subject itself to the very same laws that it is invoking.
I would also add to that for example, authors like Evelyn Goh have been arguing in recent years, there is actually considerable demand from Southeast Asian governments for the United States to remain involved in a region. In 1992, the Filipino government, in its earlier sort of post-authoritarian years, requested that the United States leave the Philippines, where it had military bases going back to its days as a colonial power in that country. 3 years later, Mischief Reef was captured by China, and at the moment, the Americans are building bases again in the Philippines with the full intention of actually returning to permanent positions within the Philippines. One of those bases is facing essentially the Spratlys, the part of the world that is most disputed at the moment in relation to the South China Sea. So clearly the Filipino government is very keen for the United States to remain involved, and the same goes for a lot of other governments in Southeast Asia. Perhaps to the chagrin of the Chinese government, but nonetheless, this is not a one-way street. It's not as though the Americans are demanding to stay in a region and everyone else would like them to leave.
And I think that's a good point. And I think that's time that we can come to this part of today's podcast. This week we asked for some questions on Twitter and the Facebooks, and I think we have time to answer one that's sort of directly related on this sort of issue. So Otis Jack asks, what are the chances of Australia getting drawn into a potential conflict? And I think that sort of segues us nicely back to where we're all recording this today.
Sure, I think that it speaks to the larger issue in terms of the impact of the South China Sea dispute on US-China relations. Now, as I indicated earlier in the podcast, I think that the South China Sea is merely one of a number of flashpoints. Number of questions flow from this particular question. One of those is the scope and nature of Australia's alliance responsibilities in relation to the United States. Contrary to popular opinion, ANZUS does not force us to march lockstep with the United States into any conflict. If you actually read the text of the ANZUS Treaty, it specifies simply that the countries will consult on matters of common concern in relation particularly to the Western Pacific. Nevertheless, the historical practice is that we have been very much all the way with the USA. So if there was a conflict between the United States and China, whether it broke out over the South China Sea or not, it is very much likely that Australia would be involved. Where the question becomes really interesting, though, is how proactive Australia is likely to be in the contemporary context. So the issues there have been very much crystallised by the dispute between Foreign Minister Bishop on the one hand and Shadow Defence Minister Conroy on the other. Conroy is advocating a much more assertive stance on the part of Australia, that we should engage not only in freedom of navigation operations, but that we should do very provocative things, for example, like launching helicopters from ships within the 12 nautical miles of Chinese installations. Bishop has suggested that prudence would be the better strategy there. For the time being, from my perspective at least, I think prudence is the better part of valour in this particular context, simply because there is no Australian incentive at the moment to bear the costs and risks of escalation. This is a delicate dispute. The Chinese have been quite deliberate and explicit in signalling to us their consternation about any potential Australian attempt to unilaterally escalate. So the long-winded answer to your question is, yes, there is a danger that we will be pulled into the conflict, but we need to keep the conflict itself within a larger context, and it's also likely that the government for the time being will pursue a more cautious strategy than Conroy would advocate.
I agree with what Andrew was saying. I think that a little bit too much has been made of the economic significance of the sea lines of communication going through the South China Sea for the Australian economy. In fact, a far smaller percentage of Australian trade go through the South China Sea than has been reported. Heard figures going up to about 60%. In reality, it's more like 30%. And even that 30% mostly goes to China. So if the Chinese had full control of the South China Sea, that would not have a great effect on the Australian economy in that sense. However, Australia has for many years, side by side with its military alliance with the United States, have at least publicly claimed its support for a rules-based international order. Which for a country like Australia makes perfect sense. It's better to be living in a world where governments basically follow rules rather than a situation where power rules, because Australia just doesn't have that power projection capacity. Having said that, it is clear that the Australian government has been unwilling to, for many years now, to examine any questions relating to the US alliance, and that doesn't seem to be the case now, and it doesn't seem to be doing that now either. It seems that the military alliance remains the bedrock of Australian strategic policy, and no one is actually thinking about that too hard in Canberra. So I think that essentially what Australia will do will depend greatly on what the Americans will do. But I would like to hope, as Andrew was suggesting, that the government will exercise prudence in this case and will not rush into anything that Australia might regret later.
So with that, I must call this podcast to a close. I'd like to thank Andrew and Shahar for joining me today and for you for listening in. And we'll see you next time on another POLSIS podcast.